The depth gauge needle trembled at 300 feet. Commander Robert Foley pressed his eye to the periscope housing, listening. Above them, somewhere in the darkness of the Pacific, a Japanese destroyer was making its third hunting run. The hull of USS Gato creaked not dangerously, but enough to remind every man aboard that 6 atmospheres of pressure surrounded their steel cocoon. Then came the sound, a dull thump, muffled by distance and seawater. Another followed, then 6 more in rapid succession, each one a hammer blow against the ocean itself. The depth charges detonated in a pattern above them, methodical and precise. The Japanese destroyer captain was doing everything right except for one critical miscalculation he didn't know he was making. Every explosion resonated through the water column above the Gato's position. Every single one. Foley checked the depth gauge again. 300 feet. The math was brutally simple. The Japanese were dropping their charges with textbook precision, but those charges were exploding at roughly 200 feet, perhaps 100 feet in some cases. The Gato floated in the darkness below, untouched, listening to an attack that couldn't reach them. It was December of 1943. The submarine war in the Pacific had been grinding forward for 2 years, and the Imperial Japanese Navy still had no idea that American submarines could dive this deep. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The assumptions that shaped Japanese anti-submarine warfare had been built into their steel long before the first shots of the Pacific War. When naval architects at Mitsubishi and Kawasaki designed Japan's submarine fleet in the late 1930s, they created vessels for a specific vision of maritime warfare. The Imperial Japanese Navy's submarine doctrine centered on fleet operations. Their boats were meant to scout ahead of the combined fleet, shadow enemy task forces, and strike at capital ships in the decisive battle that Japanese naval theory had been preparing for since the 1920s. The Type B submarines represented this philosophy in riveted steel. The Type B-1 class, boats like I-15 and her sisters, displaced 2,631 tons on the surface. They stretched 356 feet from bow to stern. Their diesel engines could push them across 14,000 nautical miles at 16 knots, enough range to cross the Pacific, operate off the American coast, and return to Kwajalein without refueling. They carried aircraft in waterproof hangars forward of the conning tower, float planes that could be launched by catapult for reconnaissance hundreds of miles from the submarine itself. They mounted 140mm deck guns, weapons powerful enough to engage destroyers or shell coastal installations. These were cruiser submarines, capital ships of the underwater fleet, designed for independent operations across the vast distances of the Pacific. But every design involves compromises, choices about what matters most. The Type B designers prioritized range above all else. Those massive fuel tanks that enabled trans-Pacific patrols took up volume. The aircraft hangar required structural reinforcement and space. The larger interior compartments that made 14,000-mile patrols survivable for the crew added weight and complexity. And all of those choices meant one critical limitation. The Type B submarines had a maximum diving depth of 100 meters, 330 feet. That was their test depth, the deepest point their designers certified them to reach safely. Beyond that depth, the pressure hull risked catastrophic failure. This wasn't incompetence or poor engineering. Japanese naval architects understood pressure vessel mathematics as thoroughly as their counterparts in any navy. They knew how to calculate hull stress, how to reinforce pressure hulls, how to design for deep diving, but they had made different choices, prioritized different capabilities, range over depth, surface speed over underwater performance, aircraft reconnaissance over pressure hull strength. Their smaller submarines showed similar patterns. The RO-class coastal boats, designed for operations around Japan's home waters and the Pacific island chains, dove to comparable depths. Even the advanced I-201 class submarines designed late in the war specifically to counter improved Allied anti-submarine tactics with high underwater speed, managed only 360 feet of maximum depth, and only 3 I-201 boats were completed before Japan's surrender in August of 1945. This meant that when Japanese anti-submarine warfare units developed their weapons and tactics, they built everything around a simple assumption. Enemy submarines operated in roughly the same depth, envelope as Japanese boats. It was a logical assumption. German U-boats in the Atlantic were known to dive to similar depths. British submarines had comparable capabilities. The old American S-class submarines from the 1920s had test depths around 200 feet. There was no reason to believe that any submarine in the world routinely operated much below 350 feet. The Type 95 depth charge emerged from these assumptions. It was a cylindrical weapon, 30.5 inches long, 17 7/10 inches in diameter, containing 220 pounds of Type 88 explosive, a mixture of ammonium perchlorate and ferrosilicate that detonated with tremendous force. The weapon's fuse operated through a simple but reliable mechanism, a water inlet valve that allowed seawater to enter the device at a controlled rate. When enough water had entered, the pressure triggered the detonator. This hydrostatic fuse system offered 2 preset depth settings, 100 feet and 200 feet. 100 feet for submarines caught shallow, perhaps surfaced to recharge batteries or transmit radio messages. 200 feet for submarines attempting a deeper escape well below the normal operating depth of most submarines in service at that time, and more than 100 feet above the maximum safe depth of any Japanese submarine. From the tactical perspective of a Japanese destroyer commander in 1942, these settings made perfect sense. Why build depth charges that exploded at 400 or 500 feet when no submarine in your own navy could survive diving that deep? Why waste explosive force in the abyssal depths when every practical target operated in the upper 200 feet of the water column? The Type 95 equipped every major anti-submarine vessel in the Imperial Japanese Navy. Destroyers carried racks of them on their fantails. Escort ships mounted depth charge throwers that could hurl the weapons in patterns to either side of the vessel's track. Even some aircraft carried adapted versions for attacks on submerged submarines. The weapon became standard, universal, the foundation of Japan's anti-submarine defense, and there was another pattern that reinforced Japanese confidence in their tactics. Escort commanders developed a tendency to claim submarine kills at the first sign of surface evidence. When a depth charge attack produced an oil slick, which American submarines quickly learned to release deliberately from external tanks as a decoy, Japanese commanders often broke off the attack, confident they had scored a fatal hit. When debris appeared on the surface, it confirmed the kill. The reports flowed up through the chain of command. The tactics appeared to be working. The depth charges appeared to be effective. Japanese naval intelligence maintained detailed files on American submarine capabilities, but those files reflected the reality of the pre-war era. They knew about the S-class submarines built between 1918 and 1925, old boats with 200-foot test depths that still formed part of the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in the Philippines. They likely had information on the Salmon class from 1937, slightly more modern boats with test depths of 250 feet. These were the submarines the U.S. Navy had deployed to the Pacific before the war, the boats that Japanese intelligence could observe in port visits, could read about in technical journals, could gather information about through normal intelligence channels. What Japanese intelligence could not know, what they had no way of discovering through conventional espionage or technical observation, was what American submarine designers had accomplished in the final years before Pearl Harbor. In November of 1939, the U.S. Navy's Bureau of Ships approved specifications for a new submarine class. The Gato-class would follow the general design of the preceding Tambor-class boats, maintaining the successful fleet submarine concept: long range, heavy torpedo armament, good surface speed. But the design included two significant modifications. First, the large engine rooms would be subdivided by a pressure-proof bulkhead, improving survivability if one compartment flooded. Second, and far more significant for submarine warfare in the Pacific, the official maximum operating depth would increase from 250 feet to 300 feet. This 50-foot increase came not from thicker steel plates or exotic alloy materials, but from a realization by the naval architects at the Bureau of Construction and Repair. They had been conservative in their earlier strength calculations. The pressure hulls they had been designing could handle significantly more stress than originally certified. The same hull design, using the same thickness of mild steel, could safely operate at 300 feet if the various hull, fittings, valves, hatches, periscope housings, torpedo tube doors were upgraded to handle the higher pressure differential. The design bureaus ran the calculations again and reached a startling conclusion. The existing Gato-class hull design could theoretically survive pressures up to 500 feet without the pressure hull collapsing. They were certainly safe to 300 feet, and probably safe considerably deeper. It was simply a matter of building every component, every fitting, every penetration through the pressure hull to withstand those greater pressures. So the standard was set. Gato-class submarines would have an official test depth of 300 feet. Their theoretical crush depth, the point at which the hull would fail catastrophically, lay somewhere beyond 600 feet, perhaps as deep as 900 feet for the later Balao-class boats with their thicker, high-tensile steel hulls. By the end of 1941, 33 Gato-class keels had been laid at shipyards across America. Electric Boat in Groton, Connecticut, Portsmouth Naval Shipyard in New Hampshire, Mare Island in California, Manitowoc Shipbuilding in Wisconsin, which transported completed submarines down the Mississippi River to the Gulf of Mexico. These submarines were entering service just as war exploded across the Pacific, and the Imperial Japanese Navy had no intelligence about them. The secrecy surrounding American submarine capabilities became one of the most successful information security efforts of the Pacific War. When the Balao-class entered service, starting in 1943 boats with even stronger pressure hulls, capable of 400-foot test depths, the Navy deliberately concealed the design change from its own personnel outside the submarine force. Officers and crews referred to them as thick-skinned gatos versus thin-skinned gatos. Even within the submarine force, many personnel didn't understand the full extent of the depth advantage. The official designation, Balao-class, remained classified. The Japanese never learned that these deeper diving submarines existed as a separate class at all. Through 1942 and into 1943, American submarines compiled survival statistics that should have raised questions in Japanese naval intelligence. Boats reported heavy depth charge attacks and returned to Pearl Harbor or Brisbane with tales of close calls but relatively minor damage. Submarines that Japanese commanders reported as probably sunk appeared in other patrol areas weeks later. The pattern was unmistakable to anyone with access to the complete data. American submarines survived depth charge attacks at rates far higher than weapons effectiveness models predicted, but the Japanese didn't have that complete picture. They saw oil slicks. Their sonar operators heard underwater explosions, the characteristic double report of a depth charge detonating, first the sharp crack of the explosion itself, then a deeper boom as the gas bubble collapsed. Their commanders wrote after-action reports claiming kills. From the perspective of individual destroyer captains, the system appeared to be working. They were dropping depth charges, seeing evidence of damage, claiming victories. What they couldn't see was the tactical reality unfolding 300 feet below the surface. American submarine commanders quickly learned the geometry of survival. When Japanese escorts appeared on radar or were spotted on the surface, you dove deep, not to periscope depth at 60 feet, not to 150 feet where diesel submarines typically operated. You went to 300 feet, sometimes more, pushing the boat below its rated test depth, stressing the pressure hull, hearing the steel creak and groan under the load but knowing the margins existed. You went silent, securing unnecessary machinery, moving slowly on battery power, letting the Japanese waste their depth charges in and the water column above, while you crept away at 2 or 3 knots. The tactics became standard operating procedure. They were discussed in patrol debriefings at Pearl Harbor and Brisbane. Submarine commanders shared experiences, which depths worked best, how Japanese attack patterns evolved, when it was safe to come shallow again. But the underlying reason for the tactic's success remained classified. Even many submarine crews didn't fully understand why going to 300 feet kept them safe. They knew it worked. They knew the depth charges exploded above them. But the specific engineering margins, the precise depth settings of Japanese weapons, that information stayed locked in the briefing rooms where commanders received their patrol orders. Commander Robert Foley, commanding USS Gato through her war patrols in 1943, exemplified this tactical evolution. His patrol reports show the pattern clearly. In early patrol actions, Gato dove to between 200 and 250 feet when depth charged. By late 1943, 300 feet had become standard. His log entries noted the methodical nature of Japanese attacks. The escorts would make multiple runs, dropping full patterns of depth charges, maintaining the attack for hours sometimes. And the charges consistently exploded too shallow to threaten his boat. The advantage was invisible to the Japanese. They saw American submarines. They attacked them with weapons that should have been effective. They observed evidence that appeared to confirm kills. But the submarines kept coming, kept sinking Japanese merchant ships, kept disrupting the convoy routes that supplied Japan's far-flung garrisons. By mid-1943, American submarines had sunk over 2 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping. The campaign was devastating Japan's economy, strangling the resource flow from Southeast Asia that kept Japanese industry running. And a significant factor in that success was the simple fact that submarine crews survived to fight again, protected by a depth advantage that Japanese anti-submarine forces couldn't detect or compensate for. The advantage rested on a foundation of assumptions the Japanese had no reason to question. Their own submarines dove to 330 feet maximum. German U-boats in the Atlantic operated at similar depths. British submarines had comparable capabilities. Why would American submarines be radically different? The Type 95 depth charge, with its 1 to 100 and 200 foot settings, covered the entire operational envelope of every submarine the Japanese had encountered. Except they hadn't encountered American fleet submarines in their actual operational envelope. They had encountered them only at the margins, in the shallow water where the submarines had to operate to attack convoys or transit island channels. They had never forced an American submarine into a deep-diving escape in a situation where they could observe and analyze the outcome with technical precision. And so the assumptions held. The tactics remained unchanged. The depth charges exploded at 100 feet, at 200 feet, sometimes at the new 300-foot setting when the upgraded Type 95 charges became available in late 1943. But by then, many American submarines could dive to 400 feet. The gap was widening, not closing. The tactical advantage existed in the mathematics of pressure and depth, in the simple physics that a depth charge exploding at 200 feet cannot damage a submarine at 350 feet unless the pattern is extraordinarily close. The shock wave propagates through water, but it dissipates with distance. The killing radius of a 220-pound depth charge extended perhaps 40 feet in optimal conditions. If the submarine was 100 feet deeper than the explosion, the shock wave arrived, weakened, survivable. Merely another thunderous noise in the dark water. American submariners learned to use that geometry. They learned to hear the difference between close charges and distant ones, the sharp metallic bang of a charge that detonated within lethal range versus the deeper, more muffled thump of an explosion too far away to cause serious damage. Experienced sonar operators could estimate range and bearing to exploding charges, helping the commanding officer maneuver away from attack patterns. The Japanese never adapted because they never understood they needed to adapt. Their intelligence picture of American submarine capabilities remained frozen in the pre-war era. Their weapons remained calibrated for that outdated picture, and American submariners kept diving deep, kept surviving, kept fighting a war the Japanese didn't fully realize they were losing. Until June of 1943, when an American congressman decided that classified information made good material for a press conference. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Andrew Jackson May was 68 years old in 1943, a powerful figure in Washington's wartime hierarchy. The Kentucky Democrat had represented his district in the House of Representatives since March of 1931, surviving the political upheavals of the Depression and establishing himself as a reliable New Deal supporter. But his real power came from his chairmanship of the House Military Affairs Committee, a position he had held since the 76th Congress began in January of 1939. The Military Affairs Committee controlled military appropriations, reviewed weapons procurement, and exercised oversight over nearly every aspect of America's war effort. As chairman, May received classified briefings on operations in both theaters, weapons development programs, industrial production statistics, and tactical lessons being learned on battlefields from North Africa to the Pacific Islands. He was privy to some of the most sensitive information in the entire war effort. In June of 1943, Congressman May embarked on what congressional records termed an inspection tour of American military installations in the Pacific Theater. These trips were common enough members of the Military Affairs Committee needed to see operations firsthand, to understand the conditions under which American forces fought, to observe whether appropriated funds were being spent effectively. The trips served legitimate oversight purposes, though they also offered congressional junkets to exotic locations far from the rationing and restrictions of wartime Washington. May's tour took him to multiple bases across the Pacific. He visited Pearl Harbor, where the Pacific Fleet was rebuilding from the devastation of December 7, 1941. He toured submarine facilities, met with officers from COMSUBPAC Commander, Submarine Force, U.S. Pacific Fleet, and received operational briefings on the submarine campaign against Japanese shipping. Someone during those briefings, likely a submarine force staff officer proud of the effectiveness of America's undersea war, explained why U.S. submarines were surviving Japanese depth charge attacks at remarkably high rates. The explanation was straightforward and highly classified. American submarines could dive much deeper than the Japanese realized. Japanese depth charges were calibrated to explode at 100 or 200 feet. American boats routinely operated at 300 feet or more. The Japanese were attacking empty water, while submarines slipped beneath their weapons' effective range. This was operational intelligence of the highest sensitivity. Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, who commanded the submarine force in the Pacific, understood that this tactical advantage was keeping his boats and crews alive. The moment the Japanese discovered that American submarines could dive deeper than their depth charges could reach, they would adjust their weapons settings. The advantage would vanish. More submarines would be damaged or sunk. More submariners would die crushed in the darkness as their pressure hulls failed. So the information was compartmentalized, restricted to those with absolute need to know. Submarine commanders understood it, they had to, in order to employ the tactics effectively. Senior staff officers who planned patrol areas and coordinated operations understood it. The crews experienced it firsthand, but often didn't grasp the full technical picture of why 300 feet kept them safe. And now Congressman Andrew May understood it. May returned from the Pacific in late June of 1943. Standard practice for congressmen returning from high-profile overseas tours involved press conferences, opportunities to report to constituents, to share observations about the war effort, to demonstrate that congressional oversight was active and engaged. May scheduled his press conference shortly after his return. The reporters who gathered represented the major wire services, newspapers from Kentucky and Washington, perhaps a radio correspondent or two. They came with notebooks ready, prepared to take down whatever insights the chairman of the Military Affairs Committee wanted to share about America's war in the Pacific. And Congressman May, whether from carelessness, from ego, from a simple failure to understand the implications of what he was about to say, revealed the secret. He explained that American submarines were enjoying high survival rates despite intensive Japanese anti-submarine efforts. He explained the reason. Japanese depth charges were set too shallow. They were exploding above American submarines, which could dive deeper than the Japanese apparently realized. American boats simply dropped below the effective range of Japanese weapons and survived attacks that should have been lethal. The reporters wrote it down. It was a good story. American technological superiority, Japanese tactical inadequacy, concrete evidence that U.S. submarines were winning the underwater war. The reporters asked follow-up questions. May elaborated on the point. The press conference concluded with May having shared a fascinating tactical detail that demonstrated American submarines' effectiveness. Various press associations picked up the story. The Associated Press sent it over their wire service to member newspapers across the country. United Press did the same. Within days, newspapers from coast to coast ran articles based on May's revelation. One of those newspapers was in Honolulu, Hawaii, close enough to the Pacific Theater that Japanese intelligence services certainly monitored it as part of their regular information gathering from American media. The damage was done, the secret was public, and Vice Admiral Charles Lockwood, commanding submarines from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, learned about the press conference shortly after the stories began appearing in print. His reaction mixed fury with sick certainty about what would follow. Lockwood understood tactical mathematics in a way that Congressman May apparently did not. The depth advantage his submarines enjoyed wasn't an interesting anecdote for press conferences. It was a life-saving edge that had kept boats and crews alive through thousands of depth charge attacks over 2 years of combat operations. Now that edge was compromised. The Japanese would read the newspaper reports, if not directly, then through neutral parties who monitored American press coverage. They would understand that their depth charges were exploding too shallow. They would adjust their tactics. And American submariners would die. I hear Congressman May said the Jap depth charges are not set deep enough, Lockwood later said to another officer, his words heavy with sarcasm and barely controlled anger. He would be pleased to know that the Japs set them deeper now. Lockwood's initial estimate of the cost was stark, 10 submarines and 800 men. It was probably more an expression of rage than a precise calculation. Lockwood had no way of knowing in June of 1943 how many boats would be lost in future depth charge attacks, or which losses could be attributed to Japanese tactical adjustments versus the general intensification of anti-submarine warfare. But he knew enough about combat mathematics to understand that every tactical advantage mattered, that margins between survival and death in submarine warfare were measured in feet of seawater and seconds of decision time. Losing the depth advantage meant those margins would narrow. Some boats that would have survived attacks at 300 feet would now face depth charges exploding at 400 feet or deeper. Some crews that would have returned to port would instead die when hulls failed under the combined stress of depth and nearby explosions. Whether the number was 10 boats or 5 boats or 3 boats, those were real men, 60 to 80 submariners per boat, young men from every state in the Union, trained for months in the dangerous art of submarine warfare, now at greater risk, because one congressman had treated classified information as material for a press conference. The immediate question, the question that would be debated for the rest of the war and analyzed by historians afterward, was whether Japanese anti-submarine forces actually adjusted their depth charge tactics in response to May's revelation. The answer proved frustratingly ambiguous. Japanese anti-submarine forces did begin using deeper depth charge settings in late 1943 and through 1944. The Type 95 depth charge received modifications. The explosive charge increased from 220 pounds to 324 pounds of Type 97 explosive, a more powerful mixture of trinitrotoluene and hexanitrodiphenilamine. More significantly, a 300-foot depth setting was added to the weapon's options. Then came the Type 2 depth charge, a more substantial redesign that entered service in 1944. This weapon carried 230 pounds of Type 97 explosive in its basic configuration, with later versions increasing to 357 pounds. But the critical improvement was in the fuse system. The Type 2 offered 5 distinct depth settings: 98 feet, 197 feet, 292 feet, 390 feet, 480 feet. 480 feet represented a revolutionary change in Japanese anti-submarine capability. That was deeper than the test depth of any American submarine in service. It was dangerously close to the theoretical crush depth of Gato-class boats and well within the damage radius for Balao-class submarines, pushing beyond their rated 400-foot test depth. A pattern of Type 2 depth charges exploding at 480 feet could threaten American submarines anywhere in their normal operating envelope. The Type 3 Model 1 depth charge, also introduced in 1943, brought another tactical advantage: faster sinking rate. The older Type 95 took nearly a minute to reach 360 feet. The Type 3 reached that depth in just 36 seconds, giving submarines less time to maneuver away from the attack pattern and reducing the warning time that American sonar operators had to detect the charges entering the water. So, Japanese depth charges were definitely getting deeper settings and faster sinking rates in the latter half of 1943 and through 1944. The timeline roughly coincided with May's press conference in June of 1943. The correlation appeared obvious. But correlation doesn't prove causation, and a post-war report from the U.S. Navy's Pacific Submarine Fleet complicated the narrative significantly. The report, compiled after access to Japanese records and interrogation of Japanese naval officers, determined that Japanese anti-submarine warfare forces had failed to uncover the maximum test depth capability of U.S. fleet submarines during the entire war. The Japanese never learned through technical intelligence, captured documents, or combat analysis that American submarines could routinely operate at 300 feet or that Balao-class boats could reach 400 feet. This finding directly contradicted the assumption that May's revelation had informed Japanese tactical adjustments. If Japanese ASW forces never discovered American submarines' true depth capability, then how could they have adjusted their depth charges in response to that information? But the report included a critical caveat. It made no finding about whether Japanese ASW forces had adjusted depth charge settings to deep levels as a general improvement to their anti-submarine tactics, regardless of specific intelligence about American capabilities. The report confirmed that the Japanese never learned the precise numbers, but it didn't determine whether May's general statement that American submarines could dive deeper than Japanese depth charges were set for had prompted tactical changes. The truth likely fell somewhere in the ambiguous middle. Japanese naval engineers were already working on improved depth charges in 1943, recognizing that their anti-submarine weapons needed enhancement. American submarines were clearly surviving attacks at rates that suggested Japanese weapons weren't optimally effective. Whether May's revelation accelerated these improvements, redirected them, or simply confirmed what Japanese analysts were already suspecting remains impossible to determine with certainty from available records. What is certain is that American submarine commanders noticed changes in Japanese depth charge attacks starting in late 1943 and intensifying through 1944. Patrol reports show the evolution in combat narratives. Earlier reports from 1942 and early 1943 describe depth charge attacks as harrowing but survivable, with charges exploding consistently above the boat when commanders dove to 300 feet. Reports from late 1943 onward show different patterns, charges exploding deeper, damage occurring from attacks that would have been harmless 6 months earlier, boats being forced to dive below their rated test depth to escape effective attack patterns. USS Gato's patrol logs illustrate the change. In November and December of 1943, Commander Foley routinely went to 300 feet when under attack, and his log entries describe charges exploding overhead without causing serious damage. By early 1944, logs show the boat going to 400 feet during some attacks, 100 feet below her rated test depth, stressing the pressure hull beyond its certified limits because 300 feet no longer guaranteed safety. Other commanders reported similar experiences. The depth charge attacks of 1944 felt different from those of 1942. The Japanese were dropping charges that exploded deeper, that came closer to American submarines' actual operating depths, that forced boats to dive to dangerous levels to maintain safe separation from the explosions. The water column was no longer vertically stratified into simple categories of safe depth and dangerous depth. Depth charges could now appear anywhere in a submarine's operational envelope. The comfortable margin that had existed for 2 years, the margin that said 300 feet, meant safety had narrowed dangerously. American submarine losses did increase in the latter part of the war, though attributing specific sinkings to improved. Japanese depth charge tactics versus the general intensification of anti-submarine warfare remains analytically difficult. Less than 22 U.S. submarines total were lost to depth charge attacks during the entire Pacific War, a remarkably low number given that American boats conducted thousands of war patrols and endured countless depth charge attacks. By comparison, Japanese submarines lost approximately 85 boats to depth charges, a much higher rate of loss despite conducting fewer patrols and encountering anti-submarine forces that were often less technically sophisticated than Japanese ASW units. The disparity reflected multiple factors: American submarines' superior damage control training, better sonar that could detect depth charges being released and track their descent, more robust hull construction, and yes, the depth advantage that persisted even after charges started exploding deeper. But every submarine lost represented 60 to 80 lives. The boats carried crews of 6 officers and 54 enlisted men, sometimes more. When a pressure hull failed under the combined stress of depth and nearby explosions, death came quickly. The implosion happened faster than human nervous systems could register pain. But in the seconds or minutes before implosion, as depth charges walked closer and the hull groaned under pressure, the men aboard knew what was coming. If May's revelation contributed to the loss of even a handful of submarines, if 5 boats went down to depth charge attacks that might not have been effective, had Japanese weapons remained calibrated for shallower depths that represented 300 to 400 young men killed. Sailors from farming towns in Iowa and fishing villages in Massachusetts, from mining communities in West Virginia and ranch country in Montana, from cities and suburbs across every state in America. Men who had volunteered for submarine duty, knowing the risks, who had trained for months, learning the complex art of keeping a steel cylinder alive beneath the ocean, who had trusted that the tactical advantages they'd been told about would keep them safe enough to complete their patrols and return home. Vice Admiral Lockwood's estimate of 10 submarines and 800 men was probably inflated more an expression of immediate rage than careful analysis. But even if the actual number was 3 submarines, or 5, or 7, those were real men whose deaths might have been prevented if one congressman had understood that classified information remains classified even when shared with reporters. Submarine commanders serving in 1944 and 1945 believed May's disclosure had cost American lives. They couldn't prove it with mathematical precision. Combat is too chaotic for that kind of clean causal analysis, but they felt the difference in Japanese attacks. They heard the depth charges exploding deeper than before. They saw the damage reports from boats that barely made it back to port after attacks that would have been survivable a year earlier. The tactical mathematics had shifted. The margins had narrowed. And submariners, men who lived and died by those margins, knew that something had changed. The advantage wasn't completely gone. American submarines could still dive deeper than Japanese boats, could still operate at depths that would crush enemy submarines. The Gato-class boats, with their strengthened hulls, maintained significant depth superiority even against the improved Japanese weapons. A 400-foot test depth meant American boats could theoretically operate below the most dangerous zone, for Type 2 depth charges set at 390 feet, though the safety margin was now measured in tens of feet rather than hundreds. But the comfortable edge that had existed from December of 1941 through mid-1943, that edge was diminished. Not destroyed entirely, but degraded enough that submarine commanders had to be more careful, had to dive deeper, had to accept greater risks to their boats and crews. The larger pattern that May's revelation represented went beyond submarine warfare tactics. It illustrated the vulnerability of technological and tactical advantages to intelligence failures, particularly failures that came not from enemy espionage but from careless disclosure by officials who should have known better. Throughout World War II, every combatant nation jealously guarded information about their technical capabilities. The U.S. Navy maintained absolute secrecy about proximity fuses for anti-aircraft shells, going so far as to prohibit their use over land, where unexploded rounds might be recovered and analyzed by enemy technical intelligence. The fuses represented such an advantage in shooting down Japanese aircraft that the Navy accepted not using them in situations where they might be compromised, even if that meant American ships faced greater danger from air attack. The British protected ultra-intelligence, the ability to read German Enigma cipher traffic, with fanatical security measures. They allowed convoys to be attacked rather than reveal that they could read German naval codes. They created elaborate deception operations to explain how they knew where U-boats would be, attributing discoveries to radar or reconnaissance aircraft rather than code-breaking. The Germans concealed their Type XXI U-boats, revolutionary submarines with high underwater speed and the ability to remain submerged for extended periods using snorkel systems. They dispersed construction across multiple yards, used code names, restricted information about the boat's capabilities even within the Kriegsmarine. Every nation understood that technological advantages, once discovered by the enemy, could be countered. Development of countermeasures took time. Until the enemy knew a capability existed, they couldn't begin developing responses. May's press conference violated every principle of operational security that governed information handling in wartime. It gave away a tactical advantage for no military benefit whatsoever. It wasn't a calculated decision to trade one advantage for another, or a deliberate deception operation designed to mislead the enemy. It was pure carelessness, wrapped in congressional ego, delivered to reporters who had no framework for understanding the implications of what they were being told. The incident highlighted something the Navy perhaps hadn't fully appreciated about the depth advantage. While significant, it was one factor among several that contributed to submarine survival. American boats survived depth charge attacks because of a complex interplay of capabilities and tactics. Superior damage control training meant crews could contain flooding and repair battle damage while under attack. Better sonar provided earlier warning of approaching escorts and allowed tracking of depth charges as they sank. Sophisticated fire control computers helped submarines attack more effectively and then escape more quickly. Radar allowed night surface operations that Japanese anti-submarine forces struggled to counter. And yes, the ability to dive to 300 feet or 400 feet provided a vertical refuge that Japanese depth charges initially couldn't reach. Remove one factor, and the others could partially compensate. The depth advantage mattered, but it wasn't everything. American submarines continued to rack up sinkings against Japanese merchant shipping, even as depth charges started exploding deeper. The campaign didn't slow. The boats kept sailing, kept fighting, kept surviving at rates that, while lower than the early war period, still demonstrated the fundamental superiority of American submarine operations. The proof appeared in the statistics. By the end of 1945, American submarines had sunk 4.9 million tons of Japanese merchant, shipping 54% of all Japanese maritime losses in the Pacific. They had destroyed or damaged 8 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, numerous cruisers and destroyers, and hundreds of auxiliary vessels. They had severed Japan's supply lines to Southeast Asia, strangled the flow of oil and raw materials that Japanese industry required, forced the Imperial Navy into an increasingly desperate defensive posture. This success came despite the May incident, despite improved Japanese depth charges, despite increasing sophistication of Japanese anti-submarine tactics. It demonstrated that while the depth advantage had been significant, it was part of a larger system of submarine warfare, in which American forces held multiple edges. But that analysis, that cold statistical assessment, offered little comfort to the submariners who went on patrol in late 1943 and through 1944, knowing that the margin they'd depended on had narrowed. Statistics measure populations, not individual lives. For the crews of submarines lost to depth charge attacks in that period, the question of whether May's revelation specifically caused their deaths versus simply contributing to a general increase in Japanese ASW effectiveness was academic. They died in the crushing darkness of failed pressure hulls, and someone in Washington had carelessly given away information that might have kept them alive. Andrew Jackson May's political career survived the press conference initially, though the incident became known among submarine veterans as the May incident almost immediately. But May's troubles were far from over. In 1946, federal prosecutors indicted May on charges of accepting bribes from 2 munitions manufacturers, the Garson brothers, who had secured lucrative government contracts through May's influence as chairman of the Military Affairs Committee. The contracts involved 4.2-inch mortar shells, and the investigation revealed that the shells produced at the Garson brothers' facility had defective fuses that caused premature detonation. 38 American soldiers had died from those defective munitions. May was convicted in 1947 and sentenced to prison. The conviction stemmed from corruption charges, not from the press conference revelation. There was apparently no legal framework for prosecuting May specifically for disclosing classified information to reporters, or at least no appetite for such a prosecution given May's political connections. He served 9 months of his sentence before President Harry Truman commuted it in December of 1949. May returned to Kentucky after his release. He never held public office again. His reputation remained permanently tarnished by the convergence of the depth charge disclosure and the corruption conviction. When veterans' organizations compiled their lists of the war's failures and betrayals, Andrew Jackson May's name appeared prominently. He lived until September of 1959, dying at age 84 in Prestonsburg, Kentucky. His obituaries mentioned his congressional service and his conviction, but by then the May incident had faded somewhat from public memory, overshadowed by the Cold War and Korea and the distance that time puts between the present and even the largest wars. But the submarine community never forgot. The May incident became a case study in military academies and intelligence training programs. It appeared in courses on operational security, illustrating how even unclassified conversations could convey operationally sensitive information if the speaker didn't understand the implications of what they were revealing. It showed up in training for congressional staff as an example of why classification systems existed and why even well-intentioned officials needed to understand that some information remained restricted regardless of context. The incident taught several lessons that intelligence services absorbed into their institutional memory. First, compartmentalization exists for critical reasons. May didn't need to know about submarine diving depths to fulfill his role as chairman of the Military Affairs Committee. He needed to know about procurement, about budgets, about industrial production. Someone briefed him on submarine operations anyway, perhaps out of pride in explaining how effectively the submarine campaign was proceeding, perhaps because the distinction between information May needed and information May merely found interesting wasn't carefully maintained. That briefing enabled the later disclosure. Second, even information shared in unclassified channels can convey classified intelligence. May probably didn't violate technical classification rules by holding his press conference. He didn't hand over classified documents or reveal specific technical specifications of submarine designs. He simply explained, in general terms, why American submarines survived depth charge attacks at high rates, but the operational intelligence conveyed was devastating. The Japanese didn't need to know that Gato-class submarines had 300-foot test depths. They only needed to know that American boats could dive deeper than Japanese depth charges were currently set for. May gave them that understanding. Third, the enemy is always listening. Japanese intelligence services maintained monitoring stations that collected American newspaper reports, radio broadcasts, and any other public information source. They looked specifically for these kinds of inadvertent disclosures, technical details mentioned in passing, casualty reports that revealed unit locations, production statistics cited by officials. May's press conference appeared in newspapers that Japanese intelligence certainly monitored. The information reached enemy analysts within days, possibly hours. Looking back with access to both American and Japanese records, certain facts stand beyond dispute. American Gato-class submarines had test depths of 300 feet and theoretical crush depths exceeding 600 feet. Balao-class submarines had test depths of 400 feet and crush depths approaching 900 feet. Japanese Type B and Type C submarines had maximum diving depths of 100 meters, 330 feet. These are matters of engineering record, documented in design specifications and construction records from both nations. Japanese Type 95 depth charges, standard equipment through most of the war, had initial depth settings of 100 and 200 feet. Upgraded Type 95 charges added a 300-foot setting. The Type 2 depth charge, introduced in 1944, offered settings up to 480 feet. These specifications appear in Japanese technical manuals and ordnance records. The timing shows Japanese depth charge improvements accelerating in 1943 and 1944. Whether these improvements resulted directly from May's revelation or from independent Japanese recognition that their anti-submarine weapons needed enhancement, or from some combination of both, cannot be determined with certainty from available records. The correlation exists. The causation remains ambiguous. American submarine losses to depth charges remained relatively low throughout the war, fewer than 22 boats total. Japanese submarine losses to depth charges numbered approximately 85. The disparity reflected multiple advantages American submarines enjoyed, not just diving depth, but every submarine lost meant 60 to 80 men killed. And the question of whether some of those losses occurred because Japanese depth charges were exploding deeper than they would have without May's revelation, that question has no definitive answer. Only estimates, probabilities, and the bitter certainty among submarine veterans that their tactical advantage had been carelessly surrendered. Vice Admiral Lockwood's estimate of 10 submarines and 800 men was probably too high, an expression of immediate fury rather than careful analysis. But even if the actual number was 3 submarines, or 5, those were real human beings whose deaths might have been prevented if classified information had remained classified. Young men from every region of America, volunteers who had accepted the risks of submarine service, trusting that the advantages they'd been briefed about would provide enough margin for survival. The submariners who served in the Pacific during late 1943 and through 1944 had their own understanding of what May's revelation cost. They couldn't prove it with mathematical precision. Combat is too chaotic, too multivariate for clean causal chains. But they felt the difference. They heard depth charges exploding deeper than before. They dove to 400 feet, sometimes 450 feet, pushing their boats past rated limits, because 300 feet no longer guaranteed safety. They returned to port and learned about other boats that hadn't returned. USS Corvina, sunk by Japanese submarine Ione, 176 inches, November of 1943, though that was a torpedo kill, not depth charges. USS Sculpin lost the same month to depth charges and surface gunfire after being forced to the surface. USS Capelin disappeared in November of 1943, cause unknown but possibly depth charges. USS Scorpion lost in January of 1944, probably to mines but possibly depth charges. USS Greyback sunk in February of 1944 by aircraft. USS Tullibee lost in March of 1944, likely to her own circular running torpedo. Some of those losses had nothing to do with depth charges. Some might have occurred regardless of Japanese tactical adjustments. But submariners looked at the timing boats lost in late 1943 and through in 1944 and wondered how many of their brothers might still be alive if Japanese depth charges had remained calibrated for shallow water. The broader truth is that the submarine war in the Pacific was won decisively by the United States, despite the May incident. American submarines achieved their strategic objectives. They destroyed Japan's merchant marine, severed supply lines, strangled the flow of resources that Japanese industry and military forces required. They sank warships, including multiple aircraft carriers. They conducted reconnaissance, landed commandos, rescued downed airmen, and performed countless missions beyond simple commerce raiding. The success came from a system that was robust enough to absorb the loss of one tactical advantage. Training compensated, technology compensated, doctrine adapted. The boats kept fighting, the crews kept learning, the campaign kept grinding forward toward Japan's inevitable defeat. But for the men who died in pressure, hull failures, for the families who received telegrams informing them that their sons or husbands were lost at sea, the strategic success provided cold comfort. War is built from individual lives and deaths, not from aggregate statistics. Each submarine that went down carried a unique crew, specific men with names and faces and families, men who had learned specific skills and developed particular friendships and harbored individual dreams about what they'd do when the war ended. When USS Gato returned from her patrols in 1944, Commander Foley filed reports that showed the evolution of anti-submarine warfare clearly. Japanese depth charges were exploding deeper. Attacks were lasting longer. Escape required diving to depths that made even experienced submariners nervous. The comfortable margins of 1942 were gone. But Gato survived her patrols. Her crew returned to port, received their decorations, rotated back to training duty or new assignments. The boat herself was decommissioned in March of 1946, placed in reserve, later used as a training platform, before being stricken from the Naval Register in March of 1960 and sold for scrap. Gato's survival, along with the survival of the majority of American submarines that conducted war patrols, demonstrated that the depth advantage, while valuable, was one element of a larger system. Remove that element, and the system degraded but didn't collapse. American submarines continued to dominate the undersea war. Yet the principle remained: advantages are paid for in blood and should never be surrendered carelessly. The depth advantage came from the work of naval architects calculating pressure hull strength, from engineers building submarines to exacting standards, from submarine commanders who tested their boats' limits and learned what was survivable, from crews who maintained those boats under combat conditions. That advantage saved lives, not through heroics or dramatic action, but through simple physics. Depth charges exploding at 200 feet cannot kill a submarine at 350 feet, That's not tactics or courage or luck. That's mathematics. When May revealed the secret, he spent an advantage that others had earned. He treated classified information as material for reporters, as content for a press conference meant to demonstrate his importance and his access to insider knowledge. And submariners died in the dark Pacific water, their boats crushed by pressure they might have escaped if the margin between safe depth and weapons depth had remained wider. The May incident stands as one of the clearest examples in World War II of how quickly tactical advantages can be compromised by careless handling of classified information. It illustrates the gap between understanding that information is classified and understanding why it's classified, the difference between knowing a secret and comprehending the operational significance of that secret. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, at depths approaching 20,000 feet, lie the wrecks of American submarines lost during World War II. Some were killed by torpedoes from Japanese submarines. Some struck mines, some were destroyed by aircraft, and some were lost to depth charge attacks that exploded close enough to breach their pressure hulls. Whether any of those depth charge kills can be traced directly to Andrew Jackson May's press conference in June of 1943 remains a question without a definitive answer. The causal chain is too complex, the combat conditions too chaotic, the Japanese weapons development timeline too ambiguous to make firm determinations. But the submariners who went on patrol after mid-1943, who dove deep when Japanese destroyers appeared, who counted on the margin between operating depth and weapons depth to keep them alive, they had their answer. They believed May's carelessness killed American submariners. And in the arithmetic of undersea warfare, where survival depends on margins measured in feet of seawater and seconds of response time, they were probably right. The depth gauge reading 300 feet had meant safety in 1942. By late 1943, it meant risk. The needle pointing to 350 feet or 400 feet depths that stressed hulls beyond their rated limits became the new margin of survival. The tactical mathematics had shifted, the advantage had narrowed, and every submarine commander who took his boat deep during a depth charge attack knew that somewhere in Washington a congressman had carelessly revealed the secret that should have protected them. The war was won anyway. American submarines achieved their objectives. Japan's merchant marine was destroyed, her supply lines severed, her ability to sustain military operations crippled. The campaign succeeded despite the May incident, despite improved Japanese weapons, despite all the 1,000 complications and reverses that characterize any military operation. But success at the strategic level doesn't erase losses at the individual level. The families who lost sons and husbands and brothers to submarine warfare weren't consoled by statistics about tonnage sunk or strategic objectives achieved. They mourned specific men, unique individuals who would never come home. And in the submarine service, the memory of the May incident remained not as a decisive turning point in the war, but as a cautionary reminder of how fragile tactical advantages can be, how quickly margins can narrow, how much trust men place in systems of secrecy that are supposed to protect them. The depth gauge needle at 300 feet, the sound of depth charges exploding somewhere above, the knowledge that a few words spoken carelessly in a press conference had narrowed the margin between that safe depth and the killing zone above. That knowledge, more than any statistics or post-war analysis, was what submariners remembered about Congressman Andrew Jackson May. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.